I'm even using my phone now. I threw the laptop away.
Oh, sorry for that. I guess, sorry participants, I guess we'll have to start right away. Accept our apologies. Technology sometimes lets you down at the moment of need. So I hope all are in understanding. So welcome all of us to today's webinar. This is our 30th webinar, and the topic today is on the transport sector. So the challenges in the transport sector amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Just as by way of introduction, I'll just give a brief context of the industry and maybe through a few words to our presenter, maybe during his presentation to actually try and isolate the key issues therein. So, as you all know, the transport sector is a vital sector in our economy. Actually, it helps to build our economy in terms of ensuring interlinkages, not only within our country, but also regionally and globally. The sector is large, so there's rail transport therein, there's waterways, there's air transport, and also there's pipeline. But today we'll focus mainly on road transport. And for most of us who are commuters who use public transport, I think this is an area that we'll be most interested in, more specifically when we look at the challenges we have now of the coronavirus pandemic. To get straight into it is that we remember before Corona, the transport industry, specifically road and matatus, there were issues to do with not only cleanliness, but even the way they're organized. And I'm sure Kimutai will give us the lowdown on that, so I'll not delve in that. But more specifically, in terms of the issues towards Corona, we'd like to see what has happened in the industry. So pre-Corona or pre the COVID pandemic, during the pandemic, and now that we are easing the restrictions, not only economically, but in all our sectors, how then has that affected, or will that affect the operations within the industry? And I think these are the issues that we want to speak to, and who is better placed other than the chairperson or the chairman of the Matatu Owners Association, Mr. Simon Kumitai. So without much further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Kumitai. We'll try to catch up on time, so Mr. Kumitai, kindly take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jairo. First, I would want to apologize for not being able to log in quickly. I had to do it eventually using my phone, and I'm sorry about it. And sure, back to our topic on issues of public transport in the country. We know very well that public transport is a facilitator. It's enabling us to be able to make movements, and both economics and social, it does both. And one is that just to make participants aware is that this is initially had been thought to be an essential service, but totally ignored. And over 90% of Kenyans rely on public transport to move. And we have movements mostly is economic and social. And that also needs public transport to transact from the places of work or places of doing business to an area of supply and come back. And this totally supports the biggest part of the economy of this country. And the pandemic definitely has hit it so hard. And I believe right now the consequences will be felt later, because as public transport operators, we are eating into our capital, unable to maintain our vehicles, the standards which are required, and that by itself making losses, unable to do the business the way it's supposed to be required and give service to people. And One that we should understand is that public transport is purely private. In other jurisdictions, you'll find governments investing because it's a big facilitator. And in Kenya, it's purely business. Hence, you see the misbehavior is because everybody's trying to get a coin in their business doing. And we have several categories. We have long distance. The long distance is buses. You can see the buses getting from Mombasa to Kisumu to Kakamega and other areas. These are now buses which were traveling day and night. In the night, they make a trip, and they had 4 employees. Now you can see now that there are 2. So it's cut down 50% of employment in terms of those who are executing the duties of driving and conducting. And because of that, there was curfew, and there was the night ban, and also because of the curfew. And we know very well the first pronouncements were people to stay at home. This by itself reduced the number of movements and affected the business, and followed by the curfew. So that cut down businesses, and other companies very many companies had to stop their buses because they had many buses, and there are no people traveling. And from now, long distance, we have medium distance, which is done by the famous 14-seaters, the intercities, the one from Nakuru to Nairobi, you'll find from Kericho to Nakuru and other areas. This one was the very main one that does a lot of movements, especially to SMEs, for people who are transacting businesses. Now, this one was affected greatly because the movements were reduced. And number 2, when we had protocols pronounced, the protocols that came in with sanitizing, reducing passengers traveling the capacity because of social distancing by 50%. And now, with the fear of corona, was so much heat that most vehicles could not make a trip, maybe even 2-3 days. A vehicle would make a trip maybe once a week. And these are definitely will, it will trickle down to other areas of relations, like, a vehicle has to have fuel. The consumption of fuel from petrol stations were affected, and also we had to make sure that you can't pay a person for not working. So all this trickle down to the investor, because already there was totally over 60-70% of revenue reduction, and we know most is that people have invested, and individuals have invested. They've looked for loans from financial institutions. We had to renegotiate the payment terms, and there was at one moment a moratorium that was given by a few banks depending on how you would approach them. But this was just shifting responsibilities. It doesn't take away the loan. So this has become a burden, and because of we cannot, it's not sustainable. When the new protocols came, they talked of social distancing, and they talked of facial masking, sanitizing, and these are expenses that every time you've got to sanitize your vehicle, fumigate your vehicle. We were put back into getting certificates, and we were using money to do the same, and we were being forced to have fumigation by people who are licensed. They were exploiting, taking advantage of the same protocol that had been pronounced. So we know very well that the other category is the urban transport. Urban transport were most would be give service to people who are going to work, and there were pronouncements for people to work from home. This denied the industry revenues. The other one was, people going to work is from maybe if it's a morning, it starts from maybe 6 o'clock to 8. It's done. The rest of the time in the day, hustlers, people who are hustling, who are looking for jobs, people who are having casual work to do, people who are hawking, taking their wares from one position to the other. So this completely went down. And with a ban of, there was a ban of mitumba at one moment. And the issue of social distancing, people were fearing. The greatest weapon against people was that you got to confine yourself at home. Otherwise, you come out and you're not social distancing, because when you are buying, you're talking to a person. So businesses went down. So it went down with us as facilitators of movements. And all this narrows down to revenues, losses, and when an industry was vibrant and people were relying on it, families could not be able to sustain themselves, and you'll find that some of them had to relocate to their rural homes, and those who are doing their businesses in the rural homes could not also do businesses that were meaningful at all, because of the costs of operation remained the same. In a vehicle that probably would have been moving from Kericho to Nairobi, for instance, you realize that the operational cost is the same, because the fuel would be the same, but the revenues are less. And we heard of stimulus that, just like any other jurisdiction, not necessarily stimulus to them, is that public transport in most cases, because it's known as a facilitator of social and economic activities, they were having subsidies. Just, it's there. And this particular case, there were promises of subsidies which were never seen. And at one moment, we were graded. We were graded like we are not an essential service. And this has impacted heavily job losses. Some people would be auctioned, because if one had gone through Shylock, for instance, those borrowing money from institutions that are not very legal, or could be legal but are not, they're not structured well, and there are those who are selling vehicles had loaned the vehicles to people, so they pay them directly. They had to recall and attach the vehicles. So you realize that it's not been easy for business. And one thing that I know is that going back to normal would take some time, and revenues dwindling as this, the country might not have sustainable transport services, because one is that the maintenance of vehicles and doing the business. Nobody can go into business now, because the business does not make profit, and nobody would put in their monies to invest in an area of loss making. So it's been a big challenge, and we are not sure whether there would be in the future good public transport as we had before. And the plea here would be the open up of the economy, because the lockdown, or rather, has been those curfews has been a great disadvantage to those who are doing public transport. And to sum up, is that the youth who actually have been the majority who are working in the public transport sector are affected so much, and I believe that we need to rejuvenate ourselves to be able to contain them, because when youth do not have jobs and they don't have income, they can easily turn themselves to crime. And it's terrible to see people, and it's degenerate to completely nothing, and yet they were earning a living. And you would tell you for sure, the related businesses or even services by the youth were that you'll find in the evening the youths washing the cars. They get their daily bread, and those who are in the Juakali sector, they repair these vehicles. and those who are in petrol stations are doing the same. And there are those who are touting areas, and probably they would earn a living, despite the fact that it could not be very legal, but somehow we were facilitating life to them. And it's been a great hit to public transport. And if not careful, it would be very difficult to go back to where we were, especially now that we are unable. There's no one who can be able to get in and new vehicles to get into the industry. I think I would sum it there. Unfortunately, is that I wasn't able to get in quickly, and because of the stress of trying to come in, I probably lost myself. But I would want to say transport is an essential service. Public transport is an essential service. And going ahead, I believe if help from the government, which actually is supposed to be the facilitator of movement, government must get involved in transportation, because without it, they will not be able to collect revenues, because public transport takes workers to go and make the government be able to collect its taxes. So, Jairo, I think I can say I've got into a position now that I've explained a bit of what's been happening and the effects and the impact. What I just want to say is that we will be able to engage ourselves more and be able to advise on areas that probably would get back to, if not near, to the position we were in before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kimutai. I won't try to sum up what you say, but I'll just pick a few points that I think we might need more clarity on. Probably just to give us an insight as to the magnitude of losses to the matatu industry and to the economy at large, with the ban on, firstly, stay at home and social distancing in the matatu industry. So that's one. Secondly, yes, it's true that public transport facilitates social and economic activities. That's right. So, in your view, what is the way forward, in as much as it isn't the restrictions or protocols that were there? What is the way forward for the industry?
Great.
Maybe
you
can
want to answer that?
Yeah, hand this over to Comrade and take us through the plenary.
Yeah, you could have had through the plight, from the plight of Kenyans, that the economy opened, and as facilitator of the same, we provide transport. And stay at home, will not, as it's been pronounced that COVID is here to stay with us. So it's an issue of observing those very important protocols, sanitizing and having a face mask, because those are the very, very important areas. And we can't stay at home anymore, because we realize that the longer you stay at home, if you're a business person, you're done. And the issue of social distancing in a matatu, reducing 50% of areas of accommodating those who are traveling, is a big hit to an industry. And unless now this in lieu, we increase fares, which I believe Kenyans cannot stand that. They cannot be able to afford. That would have been the only remedy. But somehow, when a person is 1 meter away from you, and when a person is maybe 1.5 feet away from you, the effects on anything, probably contagious diseases, could be the same. So I believe the issue of social distancing in public transport, while you've already taken the other measures in place, I believe we can be able to rejuvenate ourselves and go back. So this issue of social distancing in a matatu, and one thing is that I'm back in my rural home, And what I see, I think those who are doing illegal business like Probox, they are still, I mean, people in the boots, and they are tightly packed together. And those of us who are doing legal business are being pushed to obey and and observe the regulations that are put there on social distancing. So, and you still find the same people are doing the illegal business and having people full in their vehicles. So it doesn't make much sense. For now, I think the best thing would have been to allow a normal distancing in a matatu if it is a 14-seater. But what's very important here is the issues of ensuring that people sanitize and have the facial masks. And a way forward would be to open up the economy, encourage people to do their businesses as they used to do. I like yesterday, the president said extended some time. I think probably gradually we will be able to get to where we were before. But those who are doing business of transport should also be thought of. We can't only think about those who are operating in hotels and those who are, having night clubs. Other businesses are hurting, and it's important for it to be put on thought on issues of them doing their business, or else they provide subsidies. And I'm sure that one is a bit difficult because the government is faced by many challenges now on issues probably of finance, but we can be able to provide our services in a way that probably would not be an agent of spread of COVID. So my way forward would be, let us go back to where we were in doing business and be careful on, we must observe some of those protocols, but probably would make COVID knock on other people's doors.
Thank you, Mr. Mutai. I would like to hand this over now to Kwame Owino, our CEO, to take us through the plenary. Kwame.
Okay, thanks a lot, Stephen, and thanks, Mr. Kimutai, for the presentation. I think you've taken us through what the effects are, and we can tell that. Two things. First is just basically the central place of public transport in Kenya's economy. As you were speaking, actually, I just went back, and I think Stephen mentioned it earlier, that public transportation, transport and storage as a share of GDP in Kenya, about 9% of GDP, which is quite substantial, to be honest. And then of that, road transport is basically 6 or 7% of GDP. So obviously the place of the matatu, the public service vehicles industry, together with the transport generally, cannot be overemphasized. I think, as you also say, that the disruptions, which you also accepted, were necessary, but I think their dragging on effects is part of the reason we are having discussions here. So one of the things you said is that it created disruptions. I think it also disrupted credit markets, not only reduced the number of people who are traveling, dwindling revenues, and obviously public transport vehicles obviously are machines for which many people received a mortgage or a loan to be able to buy. So servicing those loans is also affecting ownership and definitely having some structural damage on businesses. I understand also that, of course, because of that, frequency of travel was also reduced. And I also understand your statement that, look, we need to ask ourselves, given the knowledge that we have right now around how the transmission of the virus happens and now COVID-19, is it still sensible for us to maintain the distancing within vehicles? And I think that's a really important discussion that maybe people need to have, because, as you say, if you're going to cut by half the number of passengers that a public service vehicle will carry, the immediate effect of that obviously is you have to raise fares, and obviously that also has the knock-on effect of affecting the number of people who can travel, but also affecting the affordability of the service, which is something that needs to be balanced. So I think we understand those disruptions. I think Mr. Kimutai has given us a fairly elaborate flowchart, basically starting with what happened before, the burdens, obviously, and transport goes beyond urban transport into other parts of the country, the long distance travel and the frequency and all that. So just like all other places, I think this is suggesting to us that the shocks into and out of the road transport sector, of the public transportation sector, would actually be part of what will create the challenge for the economy. And as everybody spoke yesterday about the present reopening, I actually think that the economy is reopened, except for public transport and, as you mentioned, pubs as well. And maybe we needed to actually have judged the value of opening pubs and hospitality places, but leaving as it is these restrictions in because travel, and maybe measure their cost one against the other. I think it's coming to me that yes, perhaps that equation was not properly balanced, because there was the view that the real burden was to ensure that public hospitality places are opened and pubs, places of worship as well, but we did not discuss the question of transport, which is especially critical in an urban area such as Nairobi. So, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, with that simple summary, and I think the question that you just answered, we'll open up this discussion to you. Please ask a question. You can send it through the chat box, or you can just raise your hands, and then Mr. Kimutai will respond to your questions one after the other. Can I have the questions now? Anyone with a question? Steve, I can't see the chat. Anyone with a question? Let me see your hands.
There's a question on the chat by Herman Kopa.
Okay. Let me look at it. Okay, I can't see the chart. Stephen, can you read out the question?
Sure. So Herman Kopa says, great insights, Mr. Kimutai. One question from my end is, how exactly does he envision government involvement in transport?
Mr. Kimutai, you can start with that as we wait for other questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Herman, for good compliments. How do I engage the government on transport issues? Well, the association has been quite active, and after the COVID, when COVID came in, there was we've had a few meetings, and we've made requests, and we've tried to sensitize, because I've actually been in very many meetings with government, that transport is key, and in most cases that transport is not profit making. If you have to provide efficient service and affordable service, then you'll be ready to make losses. And this has actually been causing lots of animosity between public transport operators and those who are traveling, that they keep hiking their fares. And we have tried to talk about subsidies. Efficient transport will always be scheduled. That there is a bus that's leaving. For instance, if it's town service, they have to be scheduled. There is an hour that you'll have to wait and know that there's a bus moving. And in other jurisdictions, successful jurisdictions, governments do pay subsidies to public transport companies and operators. Now, I think the government has not done much. We have tried engaging them, and there's not been much, good response from them. And I think what they need to do is to understand transport itself, because we have even talked of whether the government can be able to provide even training for transport operators, because we have for Bandari, we have for those flying, we have for other areas, but nowhere in road transport. But anyway, we haven't gotten to an area where the government would understand public transport and be able to provide necessary transport, necessary help from the government. So we still will be able to engage them. But for now, we don't have much that we have gained from the government, especially in terms of stimulus and any other thing that would have helped any business to survive. I hope I've answered Mr. Herman.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kimutai. There's another question by Oscar. Oscar, do you wish to ask a question? His hand is up. Please ask your question. Oscar? Okay, fine. Looks like Fanon. Let's ask Fanon Kihu. Fanon, please just unmute and then ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Just go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm asking, is there some labor reallocation in the transport sector? You know, for example, like now, in this meeting, we are using an online meeting app instead of meeting physically, which would entail physical transport. So are there, what I'm asking is, are there new opportunities in this transport sector? My next question is, my second question is, has the competition between has the preference maybe towards digital transport companies like Uber, the Bolt, have there been a kind of a defending of competition between those digital transport companies and the matatu sector? Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kimutai. You can respond to those.
Yes, talking of shifting of labor, any opportunities, Anon has asked. We have tried, some circles and companies tried to provide courier services. And immediately, the Commission's authority, Communications Commission authority, say you must be licensed to do this. You cannot just decide to convert your vehicles to be couriers. And their licenses are very expensive. And so it discouraged members, because courier services would have made it, if you want to buy things on the other end, then you register them and send them to the other end without physically going there. Was encountered by that problem of, licensing. The licensing regime say you can't involve yourself in a business where you're not licensed, so that we were denying them revenue. And when we looked at it, it's very expensive to license courier. Then also Fanon asked about the digital transport, this like Uber and the rest. Well, you could see that Uber had its own clientele because there are those who want to transact a business from one end to the other. And then now we had no problem with Uber. It didn't provide much competition, but they were complementing each other. The worst was when we had now Matatus. There's an Egyptian company that are coming to do digital Matatu and traverses, Nairobi city, which was the licensing regime initially thought differently and tried allowing them. But somehow the licensing regime restricts people to operate from one destination to another destination, but not to keep going around. So that did blow to the Egyptian idea of having matatus which can come. For instance, if you're in Westlands, you will come to town, go to maybe Nairobi West, then go to Eastleigh, then as a matatu. Then there were challenges because the framework in which licensing was is that there is a starting point, that is a genesis, and the end point and back to where you've come from. I think this needs to change so that we can have a transport that traverses the city. But unfortunately, this was a foreign company that came in and took Kenyans' vehicles, just an app that they had, and they did not get it right because the licensing is quite different. But all in all, that is the way to go. We believe that public transport has got to go digital at one moment. But it's got to be all-inclusive, not discriminative, so that we can have casualties for people who have, affecting people who have invested in public transport. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have another question here. It says, Mr. Kimutai, what do you think the BRT, how do you think the BRT will affect, again, competition, but also the quality of public services, and especially in Nairobi?
Thank you. I sit in a task force that has been, trying to lay structure for BRT. The country has got to develop. And as it develops, especially in transport, there must be a thought about those who are providing transport now, because they have provided transport from a long time ago. And BRT is a good system because this is providing efficient transport that is scheduled, that if you are to travel from Kawangware, for instance, you're going to Nairobi, it would be very good because you will have a dedicated lane. So and the journey time that would have taken you maybe 1.5 hours using your own vehicle or a matatu, it will probably come down to 30 minutes or less. So it is a very good idea, but what we ask ourselves, what is the fate of the investor in public transport? We have gone to this, we've visited countries with successful structures of bus rapid transit. And there is, we were looking at the best practice in Bogota, for instance, is that in Kenya now, public transport operators now gets involved. There would be rolling stock. There would be, you get into it, you don't micromanage, but you invest in it. And initially, the government was interested in introducing some buses. And right now, I think there were allocations for funds for infrastructure. And, it has clauses where those who think that they would want to exit, they get compensated for, for their losses. And for those who would want to come in, would come in and get shares in the management company. So there is so much to be done, but the country has already started. And there are several structures that we put in place. Now it's supposed to start from Thika Road. And I believe that involving and engaging stakeholders is very important, so that probably if I want to, as Kimutai, want to exceed in public transport, there are ways that I can be compensated, because I can't have my bus at home, and yet there is a BRT that has displaced my business. So these are areas that we are visiting. We are not through yet. We've had the concepts. We need to make our people understand. But it's a very good concept to have transport in a country that is efficient. Kwame, you'll believe me that I came to Nairobi in 1980. And I used to work in the military. And I would come out of the military gate, and I would know I would have a 10 o'clock bus, and a 9 o'clock bus, and you will get it. And you will get it on the time you want. The scheduled buses were very good. They were efficient. Unfortunately, now the boom of the population has made it a bit difficult. But I believe BRT, since it has its dedicated lanes, would give proper service to people. Yes.
This other question that I've received here is not related to BRT, but it's related to the expressway from the airport to Westlands. Does the association have a formal position on it and what its effects might be? I don't know. I don't know whether that is. Guys, can I have another question in the meantime? Please raise your hand if you need to ask Mr. Kibutai another question. Yes, Mr. Kibutai, please go ahead.
Yes, expressway actually is meant to decongest Mombasa Road, especially. You find that we've always had gridlock in snarl-ups, and I don't think there are provisions for drop and pick passengers on the same. It's been mentioned, we've not seen it properly. If it has provisions, that probably would make people alight, but it's in a way that I believe it's designed in a way that makes people move out of Nairobi quickly, and unless our probably long distance or the medium distance pliers would want to use it. So it depends on the exit and the entry points. But I believe with time we'll be able to understand it and see we can allocate services on those express ways. But meanwhile, I'm sure it will even help decongest the other parts of the city. That probably would allow vehicles to move faster, especially public transport. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I haven't seen any other questions, so let me hand back to Steve. Yes?
Sorry, there are a couple of questions on the chat box.
Okay, I can't see the chat box, so maybe you can read them. Please read them, Stephen.
Okay, right. Thanks. So, Mr. Kumutai Wafula Nabutola asks that have you made representations and petitions to government? And I think he adds to that subsidies are legitimate and part of stimuli. And closely tied to that is the question by Kevin Kiruma, who asks, was the transport industry a beneficiary of any of the stimulus packages rolled out by the government during the pandemic? So maybe you could answer those before I ask you the next one.
Thank you. Thank you. Earlier on, the passengers were suffering because we would keep when we have, hikes and, probably fuel and so forth, we would push this burden to the commuter, the person who's using the service, which in most cases, all the time I felt it was unfair because the government is supposed to provide transport. That's its primary duty to do that. So we have come in as in private sector to do the same. And all the time the government kept hitting us. Don't hike fares, we will prosecute you for doing that. And yet they can't step in to provide subsidies for us to be able to operate effectively and efficiently in terms of us getting good revenues. So it's been a tug of war. And I believe even now the government believes that in public transport there's a lot of money. They've not even cost accounted to know. That's why I say the government needs to understand the business of transport. That's one bottom line that they need to understand before they start doing other things. Now, Kevin has asked about stimulus. We received none. It's just like you're walking in a street and you see those grills turning the chicken round and the fat dripping. We are just salivating. I don't know who got it, but we were salivating because they were mentioned and nobody thought about public transport. Yes.
Thanks, Mr. Kimutai. I think that Kevin will have to continue with that for now. Maybe we'll need to look at that more in depth and find out how we proceed from that. And maybe if what needs to be done for the industry to get that particular package that was mentioned. To another question, which is more in line with the discussion today, is the issue of moving towards cashless transaction. And Kevin again asked, what has been the progress of the Matatu Association in transitioning towards cashless transaction, especially during this pandemic? So, Mr. Kintai.
Thank you very much. Jairo, I'm on record having introduced the first cashless or electronic fare payment, which we engaged our local IT gurus and partnered with Safaricom to do the same. The president came to launch it, and I thought that would have been a mark for me, when I retire, which I'm about to. And this very beautiful idea was brought down by the cabinet secretary then of transport, engineer Kamau, because when he was given this, because we had tailored it towards having a card, just like to make you put value. And when I come, I get a value from a machine. And Safaricom had made it so well. Unfortunately, the minister invited banks who came and messed it up and could not move ahead. Now, just to say it, public transport has a lot of leakages, and it has developed so much interest by one, workers who work for you, two, gangs placing themselves in position to sell you passengers, three, police and law enforcement officers, four, council and askaris. All of them have interests. They want to get something out of this vehicle that has money. By allowing them to use digital fare payment, there wouldn't be any money. The misbehaving in public transport by drivers on cabs, cutting you, and behaving like they are heroes, is because they have money to dish out that does not belong to them. This is a business that is based on trust. You employ somebody and trust that he's going to collect money and remit them to you at the end of the day. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Our research shows that close to 35% of revenues are lost because of handling money. And on the other side, would have been very good during COVID time, because we had actually, at one time we had said, let's fair money being paid in vehicles, cash paid, be outlawed, and it be put in the law that you have to do this, which would have been very good. For investors, I mean, you receive your revenues, people paying revenues to you, you receive them intact. So I would want to say that it is the best thing to happen. And we had also tried to engage Safaricom, and there was a platform that had been created, Lipa Fair. And I believe that would be the best way. We don't need complicated ones that, you have to have all cards talking to each other. No, we can even have one card. A person using Matatu would always want to go for a card that can facilitate him to move, not to have this card for Barclays Bank. No. We just want people to be like they have M-Pesa. They can transact their business as fast as they can. That is the best thing that can happen, and it will do blow to corrupt practices on our roads and misbehaving on our roads, because money will be away. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Kimutai. I think also cashless system, and I want to believe that it's the way to go, especially during this pandemic and going forward in the wake of technological changes that we are witnessing. But having spoken to that, there's another question from Wema Fadhili. He has two questions, one for you and one to Kwame. So I'll start with you, Mr. Kimutai. And Wema Fadhili asks, do you have the data on the number of people in the transport sector who have been laid off due to coronavirus pandemic, and how many people are in the sector and have not managed to pay their vehicle loans? If this data is available and shared, only then can we be able to have evidence-based interventions in the sector. Your take?
Thank you. Wema Fadhili, we've come from a very shambled background where there was no order, and we see that matatus are owned by individuals. And unless we go back to the companies and circles where I have members, but I don't have data, and I know this is what has been happening, but I can be able probably to facilitate the same. When we talk of, we are very poor in keeping records, but we can give you an analogy on, the same. When we talk of laying off, is very well. The companies will tell you, for instance, people who are traveling from Mombasa to Nairobi, for instance. The driver will not be the same one to go back. Now the vehicles come one. So it's just an obvious thing that there's somebody who has lost his job. And in most cases, public transport is not a permanent employer. It's an employer. It's like doing piecework. And you'll find that most drivers would earn their salaries from what they've done that particular day. And since there's no proper structure that probably would assist, probably you'll have one vehicle, for instance, and then it breaks down. And you have, how will you pay this driver? This was, we had made recommendations that let there be a corporate entity like a company and circles to do the same, but they would rely on the same vehicle to pay revenues. So we can be able to get, unfortunately, that, there were no permanent employees on the same. It's just like Jua Kali. So we know very well that the many trips we've been making to Kirinyaga Road, for instance, to buy parts or to repair our vehicles have come down because, if there's no business, you can take the vehicle cannot break down. So, but we can be able to facilitate the same by talking to membership circles to facilitate the kind of losses that they have gone into, and probably people they've laid off. And though, as I said, it's not an issue of laying off, because laying off requires a person who's permanently employed. Our employment is never permanent. Yes.
Thanks, Mr. Kimutai. Kwame, this is a question to you from, again, Wema Fadhili. And the question is, what is your view on creating public fund for the transport sector?
Okay. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's a question for Mr. Kimutai to ask. But let's start with the fact that I am generally against subsidies, because subsidies create distortions in sectors. That's what our basic economics tells us. However, I think that in the nature of so for instance, let's talk about the question that I think maybe it's the same guy who asked you the question about the expressway. If the problem is congestion in Nairobi, and congestion in Nairobi is actually not created by public service vehicles, it's actually personal vehicles that are the majority. Public service vehicles are very efficient ways of traveling in the sense that you have a small space and they're carrying 20, 14, or sometimes 30 passengers. So it's a very, very efficient one. We could have asked ourselves, if government of Kenya has $650 million, which is 65 billion, to spend on the expressway from the airport to Westlands, maybe what we should have asked is to bring the transport sector together and ask, how can we use the same amount of money to improve the efficiency of the road and transport system within Nairobi? And if it was then decided that the expressway is the one, then maybe we should have spent it. Because then government could have invested that same money, actually and even expected a return by simply providing that money for the improvements and all that. So involving transportation sector, especially urban transportation sector industry, because they're investors in this discussion, in my view, should have come up much earlier and should have considered whatever options. Because as an economist, I think about it in terms of cost effectiveness. I'm not too sure how many cars will be served by the expressway coming from the airport to Westlands. I understand the goal, which is to decongest the Uhuru Highway and the main arteries and the bypasses, but I'm not too sure that spending $650 million or 65 billion Kenyan shillings is the best way to achieve that, and it's the most cost-effective way. So yes, Mr. Kimutai talked also about the BRT system in Colombia, which is also very true. It's one method, but my view about it again is that an urban transport system or a transport system within a country is all about providing people with different options, solutions, so that you have different ways. So that, say, for instance, if you wanted to travel between here and Nakuru, I think a country is much better. A better transport system gives you more options than just one option. So you can use a public transport system. If possible, you can use a railway line where that also makes sense and stuff like that. So the point for me is, yes, government should consider investments or support to sectors that actually expand the range of transportation solutions in Kenya. And my view is that if you think about it, certain things considered, on the whole, the transport costs that Kenyans face, especially within urban areas, relative to the distances that we travel, are actually very efficient. I mean, it's difficult for people to say that because we sometimes think that the disorder that we see in the matatu sector means that it's not an efficient service. But it actually is, all factors considered and income levels in Kenya, I think the service does a pretty good job getting Kenyans traveling, especially if you live in Nairobi, which has 3-4 million people, and you are almost always able to get to places. So yes, there's something to be done, but whether it should come in the form of a subsidy or not is something that I think needs to be analyzed more carefully. Thank you.
Maybe sorry, Jairo.
I want you to weigh in on that as well.
Maybe,
so go ahead.
Yeah, I want to expound on issues of subsidies. In other jurisdictions, public transport are not charged for licensing. So that could be part of subsidy. For instance, fuel. Public transport take fuel just like you buy for your saloon car, for instance, and over 50-60%, taxes, either in form of road levy and the rest. So these are the kind of stimulus that probably could have helped in sustaining public transport in the country. Like if we zero rate on tax and other taxes on fuel, and specifically for vehicles which are doing public transport, because it's a facilitator in the public sector. So that one, and the licensing, for instance, now a minibus in Nairobi is 33-seater, which now is 15, are paying, they call them parking fee. about almost 6,000, 7,000 shillings per month. And yet there's no parking space they do have. So these are the subsidies I'm talking about. They should be weighed to be able to make it public transport sustainable. On issues of BRT is it doesn't provide door-to-door service. It gets to an area where a matatu can bring people, come and discharge them at an area where they would board BRT in some areas. And these people would get to town faster. Of course, in countries which have BRT, they complement each other. The matatus are there. Their matatus are there. They feed into their lines because it's only on a line that keeps moving. So I believe, for the interest and benefit of the country, to have an efficient transport and affordable, it would be the best way to go. But you must also be able to provide areas and incentives to those who have invested in matatus. Sorry for coming in. It wasn't my turn.
Yes. No, thank you. Thanks for the clarification.
All right, then I see another 2 questions. Maybe we'll stop at that point. But let me see. This is about the cashless transaction, and Kevin Kruma once again asks, so now that the rollout of cashless transaction has encountered some hitches, how does the industry deal with the leakages going forward? Try.
Thank you. I think eventually everything that is being done for the first time will always have hitches. It will always have a problem. And the best medicine is not to give up. The best medicine is to persist and lobby, around that. It has to be that everybody must use a card. Because we had made provisions for any person who's coming in to get a card for free. What you just need to do is to add load value. So we ain't giving up. It's only that COVID has made many minds away from each other. We had really thought of engaging Safaricom, which we believe, because they've been successful in providing platforms of transactions, such as this one. Then we can have an M-Pesa card that probably would transact this, and we're still looking forward in partnering with them. We had meetings and engagements all to make the same to make it successful. But COVID has set us apart a bit. I believe by the time we have pronouncements that we completely free to move around, we will be able to enact and go back into it and probably come up with a solution that would be best for every person. It's beneficial to the investor and even the person who is using the service, because you can load in value for a whole month knowing that already I have my money for transport in the card. So I believe it's the best interest of all of us, investors and the government in general, because this would be a weapon that would kill corrupt activities, which I can see the government is really struggling to try and stamp it down. We can provide a solution on public transport. You know very well that every police officer will want to be a traffic officer. Why? It's because there are revenues here, free revenues to be collected. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Abdirahman Gorod asks a few questions here. One of them is on whether the fare system in the matatu industry is responsive to the supply and demand forces, especially in major towns. That's 1. 2, what is the role of circles in setting fare regimes? And lastly, what would be your comments on the routes where post-corona fares rates are unlikely to correct to reasonable levels?
Well, the demand and supply is always it gets to an equilibrium when if it's a fair system, definitely it will be equilibrium, and it can be the best system. And I believe that at one time somebody wanted to go to court to say it's illegal to restrict people not to use they call them what, tender, something that would probably allow them to be using money when they want to. They cannot be dictated to. But the transport ministry can be able to provide the minister can sign in any of those. They have powers to probably put a rule that fares have got to be it's got to be electronic. So I don't know. I didn't get him very well when he asked this question of Corona when we get back to normalcy. Can you repeat it? I didn't get time to write it down.
Yeah. So it says, what will be some of the comments on the routes where post-corona fares are unlikely to correct to reasonable levels? I think what he means is that once fares go up, it's highly unlikely that they normally go down. So what are your comments on that?
All this is when there is competition. At one moment, the fares will get to an equilibrium. Normally, when the demand and supply outweighs each other, you find probably the demand is so high and the supply, definitely fares will go up. It's just like when we are going for Christmas holidays and the demand is so high, what happens? People take advantage and high fares. So I believe when everything is back to normalcy, it will settle at a certain point, because we also have costs and we also cost account to be able to know whether we are operating economically. So once I don't think there's been a lot of cry on fares going up in Corona time, but if they are up and business come back as usual, you'll find that the fares settle at a fair position. Yes.
Okay, and one more. So it's an issue of healthcare. So someone say, Kevin says, there are definitely some matatu operators who are affected by the virus health-wise. Is there a way these operators have any sort of medical cover, or does it go back to the individual medical cover? I think what it means to say that does the association have some sort of medical cover for employees?
For the workers?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. As I had said earlier on, public transport is not an area where people think there is a lot of money. I mean, it's not an area where it's so lucrative as it is thought. And when you talk of medical covers, these are costs that are quite high. What we do is we insure them, especially because of the exposure to accidents. They are moving all the time, and we have insured our crews, and that it's a requirement by the government that and we also fear when an accident occurs, the owner of the vehicle is sued to compensate. So circles and companies have put them in a pool that when there is an accident, somebody's hurt or there is death, they are compensated from that particular area. So that's the match we've done. And we are paying for them, we pay for them NHIF. That's the only, probably, that's what I could have mentioned first. NHIF, it's a mandatory for any organization, companies or circles to ensure that their payments done for them to benefit in case of health problems. Like for instance, every crew owner pays 500 shillings per month for that's the minimum for their NHIF card. But the other ones, dispensaries and or maybe better hospitals, but we have this NHIF in place, and now we also have the medical the cover for workmen compensation. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Kimitai. Kwame, if you're there, do you have a few last words before we call the meeting to a close?
No, I think we should just allow Mr. Kimitai to make his last comments, concluding comments, and then I'll close. Mr. Kimitai, do you have anything to add?
Maybe. Okay, let me just say it was beautiful, and for us to make people aware of what happens in public transport. We always of an assumption that public transport is there, but we don't know the challenges that are faced by them and what could be the remedy. And one is that we know, as I had mentioned earlier on, this is what we rely to spin the economy of the country. And as we go into a new system where we'll have efficient and reliable transport, we would want to urge most Kenyans to refrain from using their personal vehicles. It's more expensive. We will create comfort, and especially with the sitting spaces, that they will be able to use the service. so that it can also be an area they would save and an area they probably would support a business that's already existing, which is very key in the economy of the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks a lot, Mr. Kimutai. I want to sum up. I think I just mentioned two things that I think are important. My biggest takeaway from this is Mr. Kimutai saying that, yes, I think if you're going to say, as everybody thinks, that you're reopening the economy, you're allowing places where there's huge congregations of people to sit together, such as social places, where entertainment places, then we need to consider whether keeping the capacity, reducing the capacity of public service vehicles to one half still makes sense. And I think that's an issue that actually maybe I would echo your call as well, that it should be informed by the science. We should ask people whether there's really additional risk and what the size of that risk is if everybody in a public service vehicle has sanitized their hands and they have a mask on. Because if that risk is not material, and if you're allowing people to actually congregate and sit in public places, then it might also be time to ask ourselves whether those rules still make sense. I think that can only be guided by risk, and maybe the Ministry of Health, working together with the Ministry of Transport, can actually examine this issue and issue a call. Because you're right, if those restrictions remain for the foreseeable part of the year, then obviously the first thing that will happen is that transport costs will be expensive, because vehicle owners cannot run those vehicles without having to compensate for the capacity, and so they might have to raise costs, and if they raise costs, that obviously has a downside effect on the demand and how many people can efficiently be transported. So I think that requires examination. The other big point, I think, is that, as you mentioned, and you mentioned it in a couple of IEA meetings, and I agree with you, trying to make the transport system, especially public transport system, as cashless is an essential thing, first for efficiency of the system itself, but also as a way of preserving revenues of investors. I think the corruption that we all know exists is partly based on the fact that, look, it is possible for cash to be handed out or cash to be extorted. And so part of the order that people seek should actually be the possibility of using those cashless mechanisms. But that should not necessarily be driven by government. I think it's a solution that transport service providers could actually come together on their own and design a system that is useful for their clients, but also helps them to do the monitoring and working together with that and putting in more technology. So with that stated, I'd like to thank my colleague Stephen who arranged for this. We apologize that Agneta Nimachi, who was the licensing officer from the NTSA, was unable to attend for some emergency early this morning. But we thank you all for attending today's meeting, and most importantly, Mr. Kimutai, for taking time off your work this morning to sit with us. And we always appreciate your comments, and we are thankful that you always honor our invitations. So for everybody else, thank you very much. This discussion will be available, a link will be made available to all of you so that you can watch it again. And if you need to ask any other questions, please send them to Stephen, and we'll make sure it goes forth. So on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, I thank you, Mr. Kimutai, again, and I thank Stephen and all of us who are here. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.